For today's video, I will be doing something a bit different. Brian over at Bookish did a video recently, 10 books with great writing. And so Kim over at Middle of the Book March reached out to him and asked if he would mind if she did her version of that. And so she did a video of books with beautiful writing. And so I reached out to both of them and they were very gracious and they were like, sure, go ahead. We would love to see what books you come up with great or, beautiful writing. And so I have 4 fiction books and 2 nonfiction. The nonfiction, one is a memoir, and then the other is a biography. I'm not a big fiction writer, but there are some favorites that I have. So now I have a question for you before I get started. Is great writing always beautiful writing? Remember I said Brian's video was great writing. Kim's video was beautiful writing. I don't necessarily think they're the same thing, but they can be. A great book can also have beautiful writing in it, but not always. And I'll give you an example. Eric Larson is my favorite narrative nonfiction writer, and I think he is great. I think his writing is great. I had a chance to meet him, and I told him, you're my favorite narrative nonfiction writer. But it's not necessarily beautiful. It's not, prosy and poetic and, flowy and flowery and, that type of thing. So I think there's a difference, but they can be in the same book. So let's get started on my picks. The first one is Foster by Claire Keegan. So I'm just going to read a little bit. Okay, chapter 5. One afternoon while we are topping and tailing gooseberries for jam, when the job is more than half done and the sugar is already weighed and the pots warmed, Kinsella comes in from the yard and washes and dries his hands and looks at me in a way he has never done before. I think it's past time we got you togged out, girl. I am wearing a pair of navy blue trousers and a blue shirt the woman took from the chest of drawers. What's wrong with her? Mrs. Kinsella says. Tomorrow's Sunday and she needs something more than that for Mass, he says. I'll not have her going as she went last week. Sure isn't she clean and tidy? You know what I'm talking about, Edna, he says. Why don't you go up there and change, and I'll run us all into Gory. The woman keeps on picking the gooseberries from the colander, stretching her hand out, but a little more slowly each time for the next. At one point, I think she will stop, but she keeps on until she finished, and then she gets up and places the colander on the sink and lets out a sound I've never heard anyone make, and slowly goes upstairs. Kinsella looks at me and smiles, a hard kind of a smile, then looks over to the window ledge where a sparrow has come down to perch and readjust her wings. The little bird seems uneasy, as though she can scent the cat, who sometimes sits there. Kinsella's eyes are not quite still in his head. It's as though there's a big piece of trouble stretching itself out in the back of his mind. He toes the leg of a chair and looks over at me. You should wash your hands and face before you go to town, he says. Didn't your father even bother to teach you that much? I freeze in the chair, waiting for something much worse to happen, but Kinsella does nothing more. He just stands there, locked in the wash of his own speech. As soon as he turns, I race for the stairs, but when I reach the bathroom, the door won't open. It's all right, the woman says after a while from inside, and then slowly afterwards opens it. Sorry for keeping you. She has been crying, but she isn't ashamed. It'll be nice for you to have some clothes of your own, she says then, wiping her eyes. And Glory is a nice town. I don't know why I didn't think of taking you there before now. That is both great and beautiful, and it makes you want to continue on to find out what's going on. That's the first book. The second book is Stoner by John Williams. This book, I highly recommend it. This is a classic, by the way. So I will be reading a bit of chapter 1. And it starts off, William Stoner entered the University of Missouri as a freshman in the year 1910 at the age of 19. 8 years later, during the height of World War I, he received his Doctor of Philosophy degree and accepted an instructorship at the same university, where he taught until his death in 1956. He did not rise above the rank of assistant professor, and few students remembered him with any sharpness after they had taken his courses. When he died, his colleagues made a memorial contribution of a medieval manuscript to the university library. This manuscript may still be found in the rare books collection bearing the inscription, presented to the Library of the University of Missouri in memory of William Stoner, Department of English, by his colleagues. An occasional student who comes upon the name may wonder idly who William Stoner was, but he seldom pursues his curiosity beyond a casual question. Stoner's colleagues, who held him in no particular esteem when he was alive, speak of him rarely now. To the older ones, his name is a reminder of the end that awaits them all, and to the younger ones, it is merely a sound which evokes no sense of the past and no identity with which they can associate themselves or their careers. And then it goes on to talk about William Stoner's life. And yeah, beautiful writing indeed. Okay, the next book is Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather. This is almost midway the book. The young Indian said that supper was ready, and the bishop followed him to his particular lair in those rows of little houses, all alike and all built together. There was a ladder before Jacinto's door, which led up to a second story, but that was the dwelling of another family. The roof of Jacinto's house made a veranda for the family above him. The bishop bent his head under the low doorway and stepped down. The floor of the room was a long step below the door sill, the Indian way of preventing drafts. The room into which he ascended was long and narrow, smoothly whitewashed and clean, to the eye at least, because of its very bareness. There was nothing on the walls but a few fox pelts and strings of gourds and red peppers. The richly colored blankets, of which Jacinto was very proud, were folded in piles on the earth settle. It was there he and his wife slept, near the fireplace. The earth of that settle became warm during the day and held its heat until morning, like the Russian peasants' stove bed. Over the fire a pot of beans and dried meat was simmering. The burning pinon logs filled the room with sweet-smelling smoke. Clara, Jacinto's wife, smiled at the priest as he entered. She ladled out the stew, and the bishop and Jacinto sat down on the floor beside the fire, each with his bowl. Between them, Clara put a basin full of hot cornbread baked with squash seeds, an Indian delicacy comparable to raisin bread among the whites. The bishop said a blessing and broke the bread with his hands. While the two men ate, the young woman watched them and stirred a tiny cradle of deer skin, which hung by thongs from the roof poles. Jacinto, when questioned, said sadly that the baby was ailing. Father Latour did not ask to see it. It would be swathed in layers of wrappings, he knew. Even its face and head would be covered against drafts. Indian babies were never bathed in winter. It was useless to suggest treatment for the sick ones. On that subject, the Indian ear was closed to advice. Now, that is beautiful writing. I mean, it is great too, but yeah, I would put it in the beautiful writing stack, hands down. Okay, the next book is A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Tolles. And this is the only book that I've read by this author. Excuse me, but I'm interested in reading more by him. This is just so good. So, okay. What had first drawn the Count's attention was the Brits' enthusiasm for Russia. In particular, the young man was taken with the whimsical architecture of the churches and the rambunctious tenor of the language. But with a dour expression, the German replied that the only contributions Russians had made to the West was the invention of vodka. Then, presumably to drive home his point, he emptied his glass. "Come now," said the Brit, "you can't be serious." The German gave his younger neighbor the look of one who had no experience being anything but serious. "I will buy a glass of vodka," he said, "for any man in this bar who can name 3 more. And so I'm skipping a little bit, but the Count says, "Excuse me, gentlemen, I couldn't help but overhear your exchange. I have no doubt, mon Herr, that your remark regarding Russia's contributions to the West was a form of inverted hyperbole, an exaggerated diminution of the facts for poetic effect. Nevertheless, I will take you at your word and happily accept your challenge. But I have one condition," added the Count. "And what is that?" asked the German. "That for each of the contributions I name, we 3 shall drink a glass of vodka together." And so I'm skipping some. The Count says, "Number 1, adding a pause for dramatic effect, Chekhov and Tolstoy." The German let out a grunt. Yes, I know what you're going to say, that every nation has its poets in the pantheon. But with Chekhov and Tolstoy, we Russians have set the bronze bookends on the mantelpiece of narrative. Henceforth, writers of fiction, from wherever they hail, will place themselves on a continuum that begins with the one and ends with the other. For who, I ask you, has exhibited better mastery of the shorter form than Chekhov in his flawless little stories? Precise and uncluttered, they invite us into some corner of a household at some discrete hour in which the entire human condition is suddenly within reach, if heartbreakingly so. While at the other extreme, can you conceive of a work greater in scope than War and Peace? One that moves so deftly from the parlor to the battlefield and back again? That so fully investigates how the individual is shaped by history and history by the individual? In the generations to come, I tell you that there will be no new authors to supplant these 2 as the alpha and omega of narrative. And then he goes on talking about the 2 other contributions that Russians have made. And so you have to continue on, or you have to read it to find out what the other 2 are. But A Gentleman in Moscow. Oh, and by the way, I think this is both beautiful and great. Okay, so the memoir, this is really biographical. It is Men We Reaped by Jesmyn Ward. Both my parents had been raised without fathers in their homes, and neither of them wanted that for their children. But as children and as adults, a two-parent family eluded them. This tradition of men leaving their families here seems systemic, fostered by endemic poverty. Sometimes color seems an accidental factor, but then it doesn't, especially when one thinks of the forced fracturing of families that the earliest African Americans endured under the yoke of slavery. Like for many of the young black men in my community across generations, the role of being a father and a husband was different for my father to assume. He saw a world of possibility outside the confines of the family, and he could not resist the romance of that. But like many of the young black women in her generation, my mother understood that I lost my place, that she had to forget the meaning of possibility, the tender heat of romance, and the lure of the vistas of the world. My mother understood that her vistas were the halls of her home, her children's bony backs, their open mouths. Like the women in my family before her, my mother knew the family was her burden to bear. She could not leave. So she did what her mother did before her, what her sisters did, what her aunts did. She worked and set about the business of raising children. She did not know it then, but she would be the sole financial provider for us until we reached adulthood. This is great writing, and I highly recommend Men We Reaped. And lastly, the biography is the biography of James Baldwin. In Paris, he threw himself or allowed himself to draw into an expatriate life dominated by a frantic search for the kind of companionship that would answer his craving to be loved for himself, not as a son or as a brother or as a black man, but as a human being with flesh and blood needs. The end result of this chaotic and unconventional life in Paris during his 20s was a head-on confrontation with his own identity as a man and a writer, a confrontation that occurred with a directness and speed that would have been unlikely in New York. Ironically, one of the first discoveries Baldwin made about himself was that Europe did nothing to change his heritage. He was as much a black man in Paris as he had been in New York. In fact, if being in Europe did nothing else, it helped him to better understand what being a black man meant. He found out just as quickly that Paris was no cure for sexual ambivalence. Considered in the broad perspective, November the 11th, 1948, was the day that finally set the course for the violent, lifelong conflict that had been brewing within James Baldwin during his 24 years, the conflict between the high school writer and the boy preacher, the relentless prophet spokesman and the reclusive ascetic who longed for enduring love. This was an inner struggle that surfaced in nearly every conversation he ever had and in every piece he ever wrote. It emerged in essays like A Question to Identity, which he described the plight of the black man in Paris in the style of Henry James, or at dinner parties in later years, when the elegantly dressed and mannerly expatriate suddenly exploded into the uncompromising and even brutal spokesman for the downtrodden of black America. It would emerge over the years that followed in the fact that Baldwin was torn between his attachments to home and his need to be in Paris Istanbul, Hollywood, and St. Paul de Vence. It shows that David Lemming was a friend of Baldwin, because you cannot write such beautiful writing, and it is great also, but you cannot write such beautiful writing with such intimacy without knowing your subject. And that's what makes this book so powerful. I highly recommend it. Actually, I highly recommend them all. Read them all. So, there you have it. That's my take on beautiful and great writing. Let me know what you think. And what are some books that you would put in those piles? Thanks for watching.